Frank Mercer entered the museum the way he did everything now, quietly, unobtrusively, like a whisper that refused to disappear. The cold clung to him as he stepped through the sliding doors, the lobby swallowing him whole. He paused just inside, letting the warmth wash over his bones, but the heat didn't quite reach the ache in his knees or the weight he carried behind his eyes. He wasn't dressed for ceremony. No medals pinned, no cap in hand. Just a field-worn jacket with one sleeve slightly sagging, the faded 101st Airborne patch barely holding its shape on his shoulder. Time had tugged at the threads, but not the memory it carried. The front desk clerk, barely 20 and armed with a tablet, glanced up with the polite disinterest of someone trained to smile but not to see. "Excuse me, sir," he called, voice too bright. "Do you have a timed entry ticket?" Frank turned slowly, the motion deliberate, as though every movement had to be earned. "No," he replied simply, his voice a low rasp like gravel underfoot. "I've come every Veterans Week since the museum opened. I just wanted to sit for a moment." There was hesitation in the boy's face, the kind that comes when protocol wrestles with instinct. He tapped the screen nervously, unsure if a line had been crossed or a rule bent too far. A woman leaned in behind him, whispering just out of earshot. But Frank didn't need to hear it. He'd seen that look before, the one people gave when they thought you were a leftover. He moved on, one slow step at a time, the soft tap of his cane echoing down the hall. The museum had changed, brighter lighting, new banners, interactive screens, but the wall at the end of the Hall of Honor remained untouched. It was still just black glass and names. So many names. He settled onto the bench there with a sigh that was more than fatigue. It was history exhaling. His hands rested over the cane, fingers curled slightly inward, eyes never leaving the etched names. He didn't need to speak. His silence was a conversation all its own. But silence made people nervous. From the desk came a call over the radio, a quiet buzz, and then a pause. Moments later, the young security guard appeared. He was tall, sharp-edged, with a jaw clenched too tight and a uniform that fit like it had something to prove. He walked with purpose, not malice, but the kind of hollow authority that mistakes presence for power. "Sir," the guard began, his voice stiff, "I'm going to need you to leave the museum." Frank looked up, the motion unhurried.
"Why?"
"You've been reported for loitering. We've had complaints." It wasn't the words that cut. Frank had heard worse in boots and sand. It was the assumption that he didn't belong, that time had turned him from someone who served into someone who was merely in the way. He didn't argue, just nodded once and stood slowly, his knees clicking like old hinges. And then, almost absent-mindedly, he adjusted the sleeve of his jacket. The patch showed. Faded eagle, worn threads, still defiant. The guard reached out to guide him, a hand too firm on the elbow. And that might have been the end of it, one more quiet erasure, if not for the voice that cracked the air behind them. "Hold it." The word cut through the hall like a rifle report. The guard froze. Frank turned. At the entry stood a man wrapped in command. Full dress uniform, shoulders like steel beams, chest a gallery of ribbons, and silver eagles gleaming on his collar. He didn't speak right away. He didn't have to. His eyes were locked onto Frank's shoulder, the expression not recognition, but remembrance. The kind that comes with ghosts. Time slowed. The general took a step forward, his voice measured, but heavy with something deeper than rank. "You're Frank Mercer, aren't you?" Frank blinked. The voice pulled at something long buried, like a name whispered in sleep. "I am," he answered warily. "And you are?" The man's lips curved, just slightly. Not quite a smile. Not quite a salute. "Thomas Garrison. My father was Captain Tom Garrison." The air shifted. Memories sparked. Frank remembered now a photo in a box. A boy with wide eyes on a porch in Kentucky. A boy held by a man Frank had carried through jungle fire. "You're his son." The words weren't a question. They were a realization. And in that moment, Frank wasn't a nuisance. Wasn't a relic. He was the hinge between past and present, the reason a son stood tall in a uniform and a man's name still meant something. The guard backed away, ashamed. The clerk watched, pale. And no one dared move as the general turned to them all, voice low and sure. You put your hands on a man whose service patch predates your birth. You need to think carefully about how you treat the ones who came before you. And Frank, who hadn't asked for anything but a bench and a moment, just nodded, eyes distant but not unkind. Let the boy be, he said. He didn't know. That's the problem, the general replied. Too many don't. And just like that, the museum didn't feel quite the same. Not because it had changed, but because someone had finally seen what had always been there. And Frank Mercer, for the first time in too long, didn't feel like a shadow. He felt remembered. The museum cafeteria was nearly empty that time of day. Fluorescent lights hummed above, casting a sterile glow over formica tables and stainless steel fixtures. A single vending machine clicked periodically, as if impatient for relevance. Frank sat with a paper cup of coffee gone lukewarm, his cane propped against the edge of the table. Across from him, General Thomas Garrison had removed his cap, his hands folded, fingers interlocked in a posture that was more personal than military. There was a stillness between them that wasn't awkward. It was the space between two men standing on the edge of memory. You were with him, Thomas finally said, his voice quiet but edged with something sharp beneath, a longing that had turned into an ache, honed by decades of unanswered questions. Frank didn't need to ask who him was. He nodded once, eyes cast downward, into the swirl of black coffee. Your father, Tom. The name dropped between them like a stone in deep water. You were there when he died, Thomas said, not as accusation, not even as grief, more like a statement worn smooth from being turned over in the mind for years. Frank looked up. His eyes were old, but not dulled. In them was the sharp edge of memory, unsweetened by nostalgia. He saved my life, Frank said, and his voice cracked slightly around the edges. Twice, maybe 3 times. Once under artillery fire in Nkhi. Once in a flooded rice paddy when I couldn't move my leg. And the last time, he didn't finish. He didn't have to. Thomas leaned forward, something fragile in his face, not rank now, not even adulthood. Just a boy who had lived too long with a question and not enough answers. What happened? Frank closed his eyes. Behind them played images he hadn't summoned in years, not because they'd faded, but because they burned too bright. It was July. 69. Your father was leading a small recon unit, 6 of us. We'd been ambushed outside Pleiku. I was hit in the first volley. Couldn't walk. Tom, he could have left me. Should have. But he didn't. He paused, a breath caught in the back of his throat. He carried me on his back. Under fire. Bullet hit him just as we made it to the evac point. He dropped me and I. His voice faltered. The silence filled in with everything he didn't say. He was bleeding bad. Still giving orders. Still cussing like hell. Told the pilot to take off without him. He handed me his tags. Said, "Give this to my boy." Just like that. Frank reached into his jacket, hands trembling slightly. From an inner pocket, he pulled a thin black cord. On it hung a pair of dog tags, dulled by time, but still bearing the unmistakable rhythm of identity. Thomas reached out, almost reverently. His fingers brushed the metal like it might vanish. I've never seen these, he whispered. They told us he was MIA for a while. Then Kia. We buried an empty casket. I couldn't send them, Frank said, his voice tight. Every year I meant to. Every year I didn't know what to say. And every year I kept hoping I'd find a way to look you in the eye. There was no heroism in his tone. Just the weight of years lived in the long shadow of duty unfulfilled. Thomas held the tags to his chest for a long moment, his jaw tight, eyes blinking too fast. I always wondered if he died scared, he said finally. Or if he was alone. Frank shook his head. He was neither. He was angry. Angry that he wasn't going to make it. Angry that he had more to do. But scared? No. And he wasn't alone. Thomas nodded slowly. His fingers curled around the tags, and for the first time in a long time, the line between past and present blurred. I became a soldier because of him, he said. Spent my whole life trying to live up to a man I barely remembered. But today, you gave me something more real than any story the army ever told." Frank smiled, faintly. He'd be proud of you, not because you wear the stars, because you showed up. That's the only thing that ever mattered to him. The hum of the lights above filled the quiet as two men sat at a cheap cafeteria table and mourned a man neither had quite let go of. In that moment, the museum became more than walls and exhibits. It became holy ground, a space where memory wasn't buried in glass, but spoken aloud, shaped by grief and the fragile bond between those left behind. The general stood at last, tags in hand, and reached across the table. Not a salute, not a handshake, just a hand, human, steady, grateful. Frank took it, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not closure, but connection. "I'll make sure his name is remembered right," Thomas said quietly. Frank just nodded, eyes damp. "He already is." The days that followed passed like breath on glass, quiet, lingering, and fragile. Frank Mercer didn't go back to the museum immediately. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to. Something in him had shifted. Not in the way a man changes his mind, but in the way a door once thought rusted shut creaks open just enough to let in light. He sat on his porch most mornings now. Same chair, same porch swing that groaned under his weight like it remembered his younger self. But the silence that had once been a comfort felt different now. It was no longer his hiding place. It was an echo chamber, and in it lived a new kind of noise. The general had written a formal letter, but not impersonal. Typed, yet signed in ink. Thick, sure strokes. There was a warmth in the words, a respect that didn't feel ceremonial. He'd included a photo, too. Tom Garrison's name etched into a new bronze plaque under a glass case at the museum, right next to a freshly framed photograph of 6 men in a jungle clearing. One of them was Frank, younger, eyes like fire. The caption simply read, "Delta Recon Unit, 1969. Heroes never forgotten." Frank stared at that photo longer than he meant to. He traced the edge of the paper with a fingertip, as if by doing so, he might cross time. He remembered the sound of cicadas, the smell of gunpowder and wet leaves, the taste of fear, and the deeper, quieter taste of loyalty that always came after. He didn't cry. Not then. But he kept the letter on the kitchen table, unopened again every morning, as though reading it for the first time. Something else changed, too. People in the neighborhood began to nod at him differently. At the corner diner, the teenage waitress who used to bring him his coffee, without speaking now called him Mr. Mercer and asked about the patch on his shoulder. The mayor's office left a voicemail asking if he might attend the local Veterans Day ceremony. The tone was hopeful, not patronizing. For the first time in years, it felt like people wanted to listen. But perhaps the most unexpected moment came on a Sunday afternoon, when the doorbell rang, 3 sharp chimes. Frank opened it to find a boy no older than 10 standing on the step, skinny and nervous, holding a school notebook against his chest like a shield. "My dad said you were a soldier," the boy blurted, eyes wide and honest. "I have to do a project about a hero. Can I ask you some questions?" Frank stared at him for a long time. Something in his chest tightened, but not in the old, painful way. This wasn't the ache of memory. It was the weight of being remembered, of being needed. He stepped aside. "Come in," he said softly. "You want lemonade?" The boy nodded, and they sat at the table with the letter and the photo, the present reaching out a hand to the past. Frank spoke gently, carefully. Not like he was recalling a war, but like he was offering a story that didn't belong in textbooks. He talked about courage and fear living side by side. About how sometimes the bravest thing a man could do was not fight, but carry someone else. He didn't name medals, didn't brag. But when the boy asked if he'd ever been scared, Frank paused. "Every time," he said. "Being scared just means you understand what's at stake. Being brave means you do it anyway." The boy wrote that down carefully. And when he left, he turned at the door, looked up, and said with absolute conviction, "You're my hero now." Frank stood there long after the door had closed. He felt something rising in his throat, Strange, almost warm. Not pride. Not quite. It was closer to permission. As if after years of surviving, he had finally been given leave to live. That evening, Frank polished the buckle on his belt for the first time in decades. He ran a careful brush over his old boots, set them side by side like soldiers ready for inspection. He called the mayor back. Said yes. Said he'd like to speak. Just a few words. The museum had taught him something, more than history, more than memory. It had shown him the quiet power of being seen, of being named. And now, as he stood by the window, watching the last light of the day stretch across the horizon like an old friend coming home, Frank Mercer understood something he hadn't dared to believe for a long time. He was no longer a man fading in silence. He was a man remembered in full color. And the world, finally, was listening. The town square was unfamiliar in the way a dream becomes real when you step into it. Frank Mercer stood near the edge of the stage, his hands folded behind his back, his old uniform tailored slightly to fit a frame time had worn down but never broken. The fabric held the scent of mothballs and memory. A soft November wind ruffled the flags, lining the path toward the podium. Faces turned toward him, some familiar, some not, but they all looked at him now not as a stranger or a relic, but as something else entirely. A living piece of history. He had been reluctant, at first, to accept the honor. When the mayor had called again, this time with a formal request for him to speak and receive a commendation, Frank almost said no. Not out of pride, not out of fear, but because for so long he had believed that kind of redemption wasn't his to claim. His service had never been about medals or speeches. It had been about survival, about duty, about keeping the names of his brothers alive long after their voices had gone silent. But something had shifted since that day at the museum, since the boy on the porch, since he had felt, for the first time in decades, that his story was no longer something to bury beneath silence. As the mayor stepped to the microphone and began to speak, Frank only half listened. The words were full of reverence and gratitude, service, sacrifice, unshakable courage. But it was the tone that mattered. It wasn't hollow. It wasn't performative. It was personal. And when the mayor turned and extended his hand, calling Frank Mercer forward, the applause wasn't polite. It was thunderous. It swelled like rain on dry earth, and for the first time, Frank let himself feel it. He took the stage slowly, every step heavy with memory. The medal placed in his palm was newly minted, but it bore an old weight. Not the physical kind. The kind that says, "We see you. We know what you carried. And we honor it now." He didn't have a speech. He hadn't wanted one. Instead, he looked out over the crowd, veterans in folding chairs with hands clasped over hearts, teenagers standing awkwardly near their parents, reporters with notepads and quiet eyes. And he began. "I never thought I'd stand here," he said, voice rough but steady. "Not because I didn't serve, but because for a long time I thought that part of my life was meant to stay buried. Like so many of us, I came home with more silence than stories. We didn't talk. We just endured." A long pause. The wind caught his words and carried them. "But I've come to believe that remembering isn't weakness. It's courage. It's a second kind of service. To speak for the ones who can't. To carry their names, their laughter, their ghosts, and say, they mattered. We mattered." His voice faltered, just for a moment, but he went on. "There is no medal that can give back what was lost. No ceremony that can undo the weight of years. But there is something sacred in being seen, in being acknowledged, in knowing that maybe, just maybe, we didn't come home for nothing." A hush fell over the crowd. Not solemn, sacred. Frank stepped back from the microphone. As he did, something inside him let go. Not in grief, but in relief. A quiet sigh of something finally being set down. Later, after the ceremony, a woman approached him. Silver hair, soft eyes. She introduced herself as Tom Garrison's sister. She had never known exactly what happened in that jungle, only the official letters, the vague assurances. But now, she said, She could finally imagine her brother as more than a casualty. She could imagine him held, respected, remembered, because Frank had spoken him back into the world. That night, back at home, Frank placed the metal not in a drawer but on the mantel, next to a black and white photo of his unit. He lit a small candle beside it, not out of grief, but out of gratitude. For the first time in a lifetime, Frank Mercer's name had been called not in judgment, not in politics, but in honor. Not forgotten, not faded, restored. Time did not slow, but it softened. The days after the ceremony unfolded with a gentler kind of rhythm, like footsteps on familiar ground. Frank Mercer became something he had never expected to be again, not just remembered, but present. A man not fading from memory, but actively shaping it. And this presence, this unexpected late-life illumination, did not come with fanfare or headlines. It came with quiet moments that stitched themselves into meaning. He began volunteering at the local museum every Thursday. Not as a guide, not officially. He didn't want a name tag. He simply showed up. And people, strangers mostly, began to sit beside him near the exhibit bearing his unit's photograph. At first, it was mostly veterans. Men who recognized the same haunted calm in his eyes, who spoke in the language of glances and gestures, of stories left half told. Then came students. Younger, curious, fidgeting with phones until they realized the man in the corner wasn't just part of the decor. Frank didn't tell them more stories. He told them about loyalty, about long silences between gunfire, about writing letters he never sent, about what it meant to wake up every day and choose to keep going. He told them about fear, but never without hope, about grief, but never without grace. One afternoon, a young woman approached him. Dark hair, bright voice, a journalist in training. She had seen him speak at the ceremony and wanted to write a piece about modern remembrance. He laughed at the term, but agreed. During their talk, she asked what legacy meant to him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Legacy is in the metals. It's not your name in stone. It's what people carry after you're gone and what they do with it." She wrote that down slowly, like it was something sacred. In the months that followed, that idea became something real, tangible. A ripple turned to waves. The local high school invited Frank to co-teach a history unit on the Vietnam War. Not just facts and dates, but context, emotion, memory. At first, he stood in the back of the classroom, unsure of his place among textbooks and projectors. But then a boy, quiet, lanky, with the kind of lost expression Frank recognized immediately, raised his hand. "Did it ever stop hurting?" he asked. Frank looked at him, really looked, and he didn't lie. "No," he said. "But it stops defining you." That moment changed everything. The class became something more than curriculum. It became a living dialogue. Frank told them what it meant to lose, and what it meant to forgive yourself for surviving. He brought them into the emotional marrow of history, not just the actions of war, but the aftermath of carrying it home. Word spread. People started referring to him, without irony, as Mr. Mercer. He became a fixture in the community. The man who would show up at town meetings, who'd quietly fix the flag when it sagged outside the courthouse. The man who bought coffee for young soldiers at the diner, who spoke at funerals not with grandeur, but with kindness, stitching memories into comfort. And yet, Frank didn't seek recognition. He lived small, deliberately. His house was still quiet. His porch still creaked. But within that quiet was a fullness he had never known before. He kept the photo of his unit in the hallway now, not in a drawer. He added a small shelf beneath it, where people began leaving things, folded notes, a bronze star replica, a paper crane from a child. One day, the boy who once asked if Frank had ever been scared returned, taller now, older, his voice deeper. "I joined the ROTC," he said, almost shy. Frank didn't say anything right away. He just reached out, placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, and nodded. "That's a brave thing," he said. "Just remember, it's not about the uniform. It's about who you are when you take it off." That, perhaps, was the heart of Frank Mercer's legacy. Not the battles fought, but the humanity preserved. Not the noise of war, but the quiet of a man who had learned to live again and to teach others how to do the same. His life, once fractured by silence and sorrow, had become a bridge, a living conduit between past and present, between grief and growth. Years later, when his chair on the museum bench finally stood empty, the museum did not replace it. They left it exactly where it was. A plaque on the wall behind it reads, "Frank Mercer, soldier.
Teacher.
Witness. He taught us how to carry the past without letting it carry us." And people still sit there, still listen, because some legacies don't end. They simply take root.
And keep speaking.
The final chapter of Frank Mercer's life unfolded not with fanfare, but with the quiet inevitability of a sunset, slow, warm, and deeply human. It came not as a conclusion, but as a soft descent, the kind that allows breath to slow and the heart to settle into something close to peace. Frank had begun walking slower, not out of pain, but as if each step mattered more now, as though the world had become more vivid, more sacred in its stillness. He would pause to watch birds gather on the museum roof, or to speak gently with children whose laughter reminded him that life always circles back to hope. His body, once trained for endurance and combat, had grown thin, delicate, but his presence had never felt more grounded. Those closest to him noticed it before he did. That strange, almost imperceptible shift in the way time clung to him. Like the pages of his story were becoming translucent, letting the light through. But Frank did not resist. He met this transition with the same dignity he had learned to carry through war and memory. There was no fear in his eyes now, just a kind of knowing. He started writing letters, not dramatic farewells, but gentle reflections. One was for the museum director, thanking her for keeping the ghosts company. Another for the young boy who had joined ROTC, reminding him, "Your courage will always be in the way you treat people, not the way you stand at attention." A final letter, unaddressed, left folded on the kitchen table, simply read, "We don't get to choose the story's beginning, but we can shape how it ends. With grace, with mercy, with love." The town held its breath on the morning they learned he had passed. He was found in the same armchair by the window where he had often watched the world pass, sunlight pouring across his lap, a book of poetry open beside him. There was no struggle, no fear.
Just stillness.
Just rest. A soldier, finally at ease. What followed was a mourning in the traditional sense. It was more like a wave of quiet gratitude. People didn't cry for Frank. They remembered him. They gathered at the museum, not dressed in black but in colors he would have liked, soft greens, muted blues, the color of sky at dusk. They shared stories of the time he helped rebuild a broken bench in the park, of the moment he told a struggling mother at the diner, "You're doing better than you think," of how he listened, not just with his ears, but with his whole heart. And in the days after, something remarkable happened. His presence didn't disappear. A girl who had once feared public speaking now led the school assembly on Remembrance Day, quoting his words with trembling hands. The museum dedicated an annual event called Living Memory, where veterans and students spoke side by side. The bench he used to sit on became a space for strangers to sit quietly and reflect, not on war, but on kindness, courage, forgiveness. Frank Mercer's life had not been perfect. It had been marked by trauma, silence, loss. But in the final arc of his years, he had stitched those broken pieces into something whole, something human. He had become, in the truest sense, a mirror for others, not to see him, but to see themselves more clearly. To understand that pain could coexist with beauty. That survival was not just about continuing to breathe, but choosing to be awake to love, to meaning, to the fragile, fleeting gift of being alive. And so, his ending was not an erasure. It was a gift, a final offering, a whispered reminder that even after great darkness, a life can curve toward light, that the quietest voices can echo the longest, and that sometimes the most heroic thing a person can do is stay open, stay kind, stay willing to be changed by others, and in doing so leave behind not just memories but a way forward. A human story, whole, and finally,
At peace.